Okay, let's start. It's noon here in UK, and I hope you are well in your settings. And welcome to this community of learning, unlearning, sharing, praying, and connecting. So it's a pleasure. This is a webinar organized by USPG with FEAST, which is the Fellowship of scholars, Anglican scholars in theology. We are trying to bridge conversations between scholars and ordinary communities, ordinary readers. And this is one of our attempts as well to do this. Let's start with a word of prayer. That is a prayer attributed to Saint Francis, and because we are in the season of creation time now, which is 1st of September to 4th of October, and this whole environmental crisis, it might be appropriate to start with good words, which is the word for blessing attributed to Saint Francis. So let us pray. God, we thank you for being here with us. And we ask you your blessings and your love and your mercy and your spark to continue doing our mission. So may you bless us with discomfort at easy answers, half-truth, and superficial relationships, so that we may live deep within our hearts. May you bless us with anger at injustice, oppression, and exploitation of people and nature, so that we may work for justice, freedom, peace, and connections. May you bless us with tears to shed for those who suffer from pain, rejection, hunger, and war, and also the nature, so that we may reach out our hands to comfort them and turn their pain into joy. And may you bless us with enough foolishness to believe that we can make a difference in this world, so that we can do what others claim cannot be done, to bring justice, connectedness, and kindness to all our oikumen, our common world. Amen. Thank you. So we will be having this webinar for 1 hour. So 1 hour 0, we will finish on time. We are glad to have here Dr. Emily Colgan from Aotearoa New Zealand. She is a Bible scholar and a theologian, and very well rooted in her place and in the Word. So she will be sharing with us some thoughts, some provocative questions and information. We will do in the way that she will speaking for a bit to share, and then we will go into breakout rooms. When the time goes, you will have to choose your breakout rooms, which will be by language. 2 groups of English, 1 group for Portuguese, and 1 group for Spanish speakers, if there are any. We will have we are having interpretation now, so please, I will do this in the 3 languages. It might be easy. So for the English speakers, when someone in Spanish or in Portuguese speaks, you have to go to the globe and click in the English channel. Para ustedes que hablan español, tienes que ir al globo y indicar que quieren oír en español. Para quem fala português, vocês têm que ir no globo e indicar que vocês querem ouvir em português. A opção está ali. So please go to check your channels. We thank in advance Felipe and Caroline, who is interpreting for us today. So it's a hard work, and we hold them in prayer as well as we go. And then after the breakout rooms, we will have a time for Q&A or comments or observations, and then we'll get to a close before the hour, so we get on time. Thank you very much. So welcome, Emily, to our virtual family, to this circle of sharing knowledge, unlearning, and challenging. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Paulo. And I'm just going to, I'm going to begin with a greeting. So tēnā koutou katoa. I want to begin by acknowledging the whenua, the land upon which I stand, which graciously nourishes me, and also to mihi, to greet the mana whenua, the people who have authority here, who are the kaitiaki or the guardians of this rohe, this area. So, kei te noho au I Tāmaki Makaurau, Auckland, I tipu mai au kei raro I te taumarumaru o Hinero, I te taha o te Waitemata. Ko ngā te whātua o rākei, te mana whenua, te iwi whakaruru hau, o reira tēnei te mihi nunui ana kia rātou katoa. Kia koutou katoa, ka huhu mai nei, e mihi nunui ana kia koutou katoa. So that's a greeting. I'm acknowledging the land, as I said earlier, but also the people who are the Indigenous guardians, the kaitiaki of this rohe, of this area. So as Paulo said, my name is Emily Colgan. I am the principal of the Anglican Theological College here in Aotearoa, New Zealand and Polynesia. St. John's Theological College, te wānanga o Hoani Tapu, te Kaikauwhau I te Rongopai. I am a lecturer in Hebrew Bible, and in particular my research focuses on the relationship between the Bible and contemporary communities, and I'm interested in exploring the ways in which ideologies contained within biblical texts continue to inform communities in the present. And so I'm interested in the way in which the Bible has impacted and continues to impact communities, both human and other than human, here in Aotearoa today. So I'm interested in ecological representations in the Bible, but also depictions of gender and violence. So I'm going to share my screen. And hopefully you'll be able to see that. Is that all good? Cool.
Emily,
so, yes.
Emily, just a comment. So the interpreters are asking you if you can slow down a bit.
Slow down. Yep. Sorry, I will slow down. Sorry, I always go too fast when I greet people. Sure. So, in his now infamous work, The British Colonization of New Zealand, colonial mastermind Edwin Gibbon Wakefield rhetorically asked, "Is it not the will of God that the earth should be replenished and subdued, that the desert should give rise to the fruitful field?" The imagery employed by Wakefield, which sets the fertile field against the desert land, is echoed in the rhetoric of other 19th century British colonists in Aotearoa, who also drew on a dualistic wilderness garden logic as a powerful symbolic tool to further the colonial endeavour. While it's difficult to establish a definitive intertextual connection between the images found in the Bible and the language employed by British colonists, it seems plausible, at least, that these settlers were drawing on a similar binary found in biblical literature. So my talk tonight, or today, wherever you are, uses an eco-rhetorical methodology to look at Jeremiah 17, verses 5 to 8, before tracing some of the intertextual echoes of that imagery and noting the role that such language may have played in dictating the terms of encounter between British settlers and the land of Aotearoa. And then finally, I'll offer a counter reading of that biblical passage and explore how these reflections might assist churches in confronting the ongoing effects of colonial injustice in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I will be using the word Aotearoa, which is the Maori, the Indigenous name for New Zealand. So I'll be using those two words interchangeably. Not sure why. Cool. So here's the text that we're working with tonight. Jeremiah 17 is a relatively well-known biblical passage, which at first glance draws parallels between the curse of a tree in the wilderness and those who trust in mortals, and the blessings of a tree beside water, and those who trust in God. So I'm just going to read the text there for you so that we all have a sense of what we're working with. It reads, "Thus says the Lord, cursed are those who trust in mere mortals and make mere flesh their strength, whose hearts turn away from the Lord. They shall be like a shrub in the desert, and shall not see when relief comes. They shall live in the parched places of the wilderness, in an uninhabited salt land. Blessed are those who trust in the Lord, whose trust is the Lord. They shall be like a tree planted by water, sending out its roots by the stream. It shall not fear when heat comes, and its leaves shall stay green. In the year of drought, it is not anxious, and it does not cease to bear fruit." So rather than explore the kind of the wisdom instruction in this passage, I want to explore the way in which the land becomes a metaphor for these ideas, creating a dualistic contrast between the barren wilderness and the fertile garden. So there's going to be a little bit of technical exploration of the biblical text, and then we'll make some connections between the text and the context of Aotearoa New Zealand, and we'll do a little bit of analysis there. So, a poem of 4 one-verse stanzas makes up this text, forming 2 contrasting sections. In stanzas, or the kind of the verses 1 and 3, they focus on the relationship between the human individual and God, and the typical curse-blessing formula creates a nice symmetry in the opening cola of these 2 verses, or these 2 stanzas. The parallelism between these verses clearly establishes the curse associated with rejecting God and the blessing that emerges from faithfulness. But I want to, and I've kind of highlighted the text in different ways to show those parallels. But what the passages that I really want to focus on are verses or stanzas 2 and 4, because land-based imagery is drawn upon here to describe the contrasting human individuals. As in the previous stanzas, the first line of verse 6 matches the first of verse 8, introducing the image of a tree and its surrounding environment. As the parallel imagery between these stanzas unfolds, so the trees and their environmental contexts are contrasted. The parched and barren wilderness is portrayed as an instrument of divine curse, while the implied abundance of the fertile land reflects God's blessing. Oh, no, I'll go back, sorry. We'll keep on that, stay on that page. So central to the metaphor that illustrates the contrast between curse and blessing are images of the shrub in verse 6 and the tree in verse 8, which represent the cursed individual and the blessed individual respectively. Although these analogies rely on the figures of the shrub and the tree specifically, these plants can't be separated from their respective environs, which enable life or death, blessing or curse. The meaning of the Hebrew word for shrub is ambiguous, allowing for a range of interpretations. Not only does this term denote a small tamarisk bush, it's also used to mean destitute, stripped, laid bare, or childless. So by exploiting the multiple meanings of this single word, this phrase not only introduces the metaphorical subject of stanzas 2 and 4, but it also hints at the plight of those who are cursed. Through this wordplay, the text alludes to the land upon which the shrub depends. It introduces an association between desert and infertility, which connects this land with ideas of hopelessness and death. Symmetrical juxtaposition is achieved in verse 8, as the image of the shrub is contrasted with that of the tree that does not cease to bear fruit. If the land associated with the shrub is barren and empty, the land of the fruitful tree is lush and fecund. The image of the desert and its negative connotations in verse 6 is contrasted with a land of water and streams in verse 8. Heightened separation is achieved between these two types of land as the heat of the desert and its associated drought is set against the cool moisture of a land blessed by precipitation. This distinction is highlighted in the third colon of the second stanza, as the desert is described as a wilderness with parched or burned places. The suggestion of heat in the desert now becomes explicit as the wilderness is imagined being burnt or scorched by the sun. This image is then balanced by one of moisture implied in the green leaves of the blessed tree in verse 8 that does not fear when heat comes. In the same way that the fertile soil enables fruitful abundance and is a source of blessing, so the parched land of the wilderness is a place of, and the desert is a place of scorching heat and death, making it the means by which God's curse is implemented. Confirmation of the connection between the wilderness and the notion of curse is evident in the wordplay of the final designation of this wilderness as a salt land in verse 6. Manukura translates to mean both salt and to be barren, reiterating the infertility associated with the image of the shrub, but now extending this association to the greater wilderness. As an indication of the unsuitability of soil for cultivation, the presence of salt in the land emphasizes again the inhospitable or the unsuitability of soil for cultivation. The presence of salt in the land emphasizes again how inhospitable the wilderness is, which is an impression that's underlined in the claim that this land is without inhabitant. The lack of productive potential in the saline land ensures a negative designation, like a barren woman who is not able to conform to the expectations of patriarchal social norms through reproduction. So this land does not adhere to the anthropocentric demand that it be of cultivatable use. In this sense, the land itself becomes a curse. As it is without seed, salt gives symbolic expression to the notion of infertility, expressing a land that has been relegated to perpetual desolation, in that it is both the subject and object of divine curse. As the symbolic amalgam of curse, punishment, drought, infertility, and death, the wilderness typifies that which the dominant consciousness finds abhorrent. It is the other against which the Western human identity has traditionally been defined. By virtue of its otherness, the wilderness is a threatening presence, requiring these humans to recognize their vulnerability and to acknowledge the dependence upon land for survival. The association of wilderness with drought, infertility, and death forces readers to confront the lack of authority and control in the world and to face finitude in death. Given the rhetorical power of this symbol to induce fear and panic, it's hardly surprising that the image of the wilderness is so often synonymous with divine displeasure. Nor is it any wonder that this land is understood as an instrument of curse upon those who neglect their deity. By being depicted as the means by which God communicates displeasure, the wilderness appears as an instrument or tool within the text. If the wilderness conditions depicted represent the instruments of divine curse, it follows that these conditions must themselves be considered undesirable. The characteristics of wilderness then reflect for humanity an outward expression of the divine curse upon those whose hearts turn away from God. The wilderness is a place of punishment, and as a symbol of judgment, it becomes synonymous with the wrath of God. Wilderness here has no inherent value in and of itself. Rather, its value lies in its use to God as a communicative device. Through its association with concepts of disobedience and judgment, The wilderness becomes a moral category, conceived as a transitory state of temporary incompletion, and as such, it awaits restoration through transformation into the idealized garden. In addition to the physical distinctions between garden and wilderness, then, these two types of land are further differentiated by their moral and spiritual nuances. The connection between wilderness and punishment is underscored by the absence of God in the cursed stanzas in verses 5 and 6, which are made all the more conspicuous by the repetition of the word God and to trust in a chiasmus. You can see there that introduces the stanzas concerning the land of fruit and abundance. So you can see in God to trust in God. So there's that repetition of God's presence in the land that is garden, the garden land. If wilderness is not an ultimate symbol or goal in itself, but rather a liminal place that presents a barrier to both God and garden, transformation of the space becomes a moral imperative. Without subjectivity or inherent worth, the wilderness is vulnerable to manipulation and exploitation in the name of transformation and betterment. I want to move briefly now from the biblical text to the context of 19th century Aotearoa New Zealand. As is the case in other colonized lands, the British colonial enterprise in Aotearoa brought large-scale environmental devastation, as settlers came to, quote, lay the basis of a true civilization, not only to subdue nature and till the soil, but impelled by Anglo-Saxon ardor and energy to develop all that is worthy of development. That's William Fox, who was a premier here in Aotearoa in 1868. This period of history in Aotearoa is marked by a strong missionary presence and an increasing number of British settlers who, if not practicing Christians, were biblically literate. Echoing the Jeremianic imagery, descriptions of land by colonial settlers present Aotearoa as a desolate and barren place without human inhabitant. CMS missionary Thomas Chapman, for example, bemoans that it has many, many times been grief of mind to see thousands of acres of land lying waste and miles of country desolate and entirely uninhabited. It's also not uncommon to find references that reflect a connection between God's curse and the wilderness. In 1840, for example, William Barrett Marshall wrote, when any place is left desolate by man, it becomes a waste, no longer a well-watered garden, but a wild and weary wilderness. The Christian spectator will remember that the barrenness by which he is surrounded is the curse laid by a merciful but holy God. The fight against the wilderness became a moral imperative for many of these settlers as the land came to represent the chaos of that which exists outside the realm of God and Christendom. Set in antithetical parallel to these descriptions of the unruly wilderness is the ultimate ideal of the carefully cultivated garden of the English homeland. As British naturalist John Richardson observed in 1843, colonial settlers in New Zealand sought to, quote, overthrow the native forests with a view to their replacement by farmhouses, verdant pastures, and rich crops of cereal. This imagery is also found in the reflections of CMS missionary Reverend Richard Taylor, who in 1849 wrote, this morning I walked over to Mr. Chapman's garden. The ground was literally strewn with fallen apples. I took a group of Maori to see them and bid them compare that fruitful garden with the fruitless wilderness we had just passed over, that they might see what civilization could effect. The garden thus becomes a powerful symbolic tool that represents the aspirational objectives prescribed by the dualistic wilderness garden logic. As the wilderness outwardly embodies the chaos of an unfamiliar land, so this image of the garden reflects the growing control that the colonists had over their surroundings. The ability to organize and command, as seen in the imposition of the garden, affirmed the power of the colonial master over and against the wilderness. Here, the garden is employed as a tool of oppression, used by an imperial authority to express their intention of domination and to demonstrate power and authority. The powerful symbolic worlds associated with garden and wilderness that we saw in the ancient biblical literature and mirrored in the contemporary contextual literature thus provided both the framework and the motivation for the actualization of these symbolic realities. And these actions irrevocably altered this country's distinctive land, all but destroying its diverse other than human ecosystems. In 1840, for example, New Zealand had 670,000 hectares of fresh wetlands, which were valued by Māori as mahinga kai, or gathering grounds for food. Over the next 150 years, all but 15% of the wetlands were drained and turned into pastured paddocks. Botanic gardens also quickly became agencies of imperialism, becoming distribution centres for exotic plant species which took to the soil here. It's estimated that over 30,000 types of flowering and cone-bearing plants have been introduced to Aotearoa, which has resulted in massive changes to the land's unique biodiversity and has contributed to over 100 New Zealand plant species being classified as either critical, endangered, or extinct. It's also crucial to acknowledge here that it was not only the land and its other than human inhabitants that were the subject of colonial conquest, as these British settlers sought to bring light to this dark and empty wilderness. The agency of the indigenous people here, Māori, was also rejected, as the subordinate status of indigenous peoples bound them in the colonial mind to the wilderness context. Thomas Chapman identifies Māori and wilderness as being part of the same unsatisfactory state, writing that the wilds were too true a counterpart of the inhabitants that possess it. A similar intertwining of Māori and wilderness is seen in the words of Wesleyan missionary Kurt Schneckenberg, who advised Māori that if you find your mind or your heart to be a wilderness, cultivate it in the same manner you would your fields. Cut down the bush, spare no sin. Like the larger context of which they were perceived to be a part, Māori were to be subjected to the transformative betterment of English civilization. In many contexts, the so-called colonial enlightenment of the wilderness resulted in Māori alienation from their land, as settlers maintained that no one could claim dominion over lands whose soil did not bear the marks of their labour on it. Schneckenberg again insists that wilderness land is worth nothing to its native owners. Absolutely, they would suffer little or nothing from having parted with land which they do not use. Uncultivated land was wilderness, and as the cultural and religious symbol stipulated, wilderness was empty of human existence and was thus without claim of ownership. Not only did this wilderness ideology result in significant changes to the physical landscape of Aotearoa, it also brought about widespread raupatu, or theft, of indigenous land, which would have devastating intergenerational implications for the social, economic, and political well-being of Māori communities. I want to return to the biblical text once more. One of the inherent difficulties in the representation of both wilderness and garden in this Jeremianic passage is the way in which the land is assigned value based on its conformity to anthropocentric norms and ideals. On the one hand, these norms and ideals are inescapable because the concept of wilderness is itself anthropocentric, a way of positioning a particular human individual in relation to the external environment. On the other hand, such language limits alternative perceptions of wilderness as it is defined exclusively in terms of its relationship to humanity. Understanding the wilderness as infertile, for example, refers to soil that does not grow desirable produce for human communities. To say that the desert is uninhabited, in verse 6, means that it's without human inhabitants. When wilderness is seen as a parched and uninhabited place of fear and desolation, this is a particular human perception of this reality, which is then set against the perceived abundance and security of the garden. By moving beyond these binary opposites that determine meaning in this text, though, the wilderness can be seen in a new light, as ultimate end, as home. That's a tamarisk bush just there. Free from the proverbial polarity that constrains Western understandings of wilderness. This land becomes the habitat of the shrub and by extension, the dwelling place of additional other than human communities. Although the wilderness is the home of the curse to a Western identity, it is simply a home to those other than human communities. This slight shift in perspective sheds new light on the shrub as it becomes a symbol of strength and resilience of wilderness life. The shrub thus challenges the anthropocentric assumption that because the wilderness is unfit for human habitation, it's utterly uninhabited. Far from being withered and lifeless, this shrub lives, literally to dwell, in the wilderness. Rather than reflecting the worst possible punishment, it could equally stand for the tenacity and capacity to thrive that is characteristic of life that finds its home in the wilderness. With this shift of understanding comes an acknowledgement of the authority and autonomy of these wilderness communities and the land that sustains them. They exhibit independence from humanity, maintaining themselves for immense periods of time, comfortably adapting to the climatic conditions outlined in verses 6 and 8. While the anthropocentric eye may perceive the wilderness as a monotony of endless waste, this land is, in fact, the domain of other nations, ecosystems that are nourished by their surroundings, thriving in the parched places of human suffering. Despite conditions considered hostile by some human standards, the shrub is a testament to the land's ongoing nurture of its other than human communities. Without denying the harsh realities of competition for survival within these communities, wilderness as home affirms this land as a place of belonging for those who dwell there. Instead of being perceived as empty due to the absence of human inhabitants, the wilderness is understood as being full with the presence of long-evolving biotic communities and animal species that know this place as home. By acknowledging the self-determining patterns evident in this land, the wilderness can be conceived as an autonomous other who is recognized and valued as independent. As other, the temptation to insist on conformity to anthropocentric norms and ideals is resisted. A distinction is thus maintained between humanity and wilderness, but rather than a hyper-separated distinction between dualistic opposites, the separation is one of awe-felt respect for the sovereign other that is the wilderness. As an autonomous agent capable of sustaining life and responding to external variants like drought, the land demands the reader recognize its subjectivity and inherent worth. This in turn shifts the perception of wilderness from that of object and a means to an end to that of subject and an end in itself. Far from being an uninhabited, chaotic void that offers nothing to humanity, this land, by its very nature, enables opportunity for alternative orientations which challenge those traditional, theological anthropologies of dominance and mastery passed down by colonial Christianity. As a reality that is in no way conditioned by human concerns, the wilderness is a reminder that the land's nourishment is not exclusive to human beings. Rather, humanity belongs to a vast and interconnected order that is created and sustained by this other. Such knowledge diminishes the Western sense of self-importance and destabilizes the long-held understanding of humanity as being at the center of all meaningful existence. From a decentered location, readers are better able to envision an alternative relationship with this land and its other than human inhabitants. This alternative orientation does not seek to negate or transcend the fearful response of humanity to wilderness. Rather, this response is seen as just that. It's a human response. What is negated, however, is the malevolence understood as being inherent in this space and the consequent imperative for redemption through transformation. Moreover, in our own contemporary context, this alternative orientation might also work to interrupt the discourses of mastery and subjugation that have dominated both text, the biblical text, and context of Aotearoa at such cost for so long. This site of interruption offers an opportunity for churches in particular to acknowledge the horrific violence caused to whenua, land, and tangata whenua, people of the land, as a result of colonization. It compels churches to confront our collusion in the colonial enterprise and to recognize the ways in which biblical rhetoric has been appropriated to legitimize the violation, exploitation, destruction, and theft of land and Indigenous communities, both human and other than human. And most importantly, it impels churches to further engage in the crucial work of redressing, compensating, and returning to Māori that which has been silenced or stolen in order that the wilderness give rise to the fruitful field. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily, for such a inspiring and provocative conversation. And some things were new for some things are just carrying on, but thank you very much.